And that is the 1968 Summer Olympic Games, which were referred to as a civil rights protest heard worldwide. And I'm sure you have a little bit of thought process in this. Maybe you've heard of it, but there's quite a story behind it. And I think it's very, very important that students understand this particular protest. Because sports is where you get your attention, right? Usually that's what happens. So, probably the most noticeable protest of the 1960s happened at one of the most publicized sporting events that we have in the world. And that was the 1968 Summer Olympic Games that were being held in Mexico City. So again, probably one of the most public and most well-remembered civil rights protests of the 1960s occurred during the 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City. It all centered around two young black athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos. This whole thing surrounded two black athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos. And it all surrounded one particular race in the 1968 Summer Olympic Games, the 200-meter run. So this whole thing centers around two black athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, and one particular race in the Summer Olympic Games, the 200 meters. What happened is Tommie Smith was the favorite going into the Olympic Games to win the gold medal in the 200 meters, and John Carlos was a close second. And there was a lot of debate over whether Carlos could beat Smith or Smith could defeat Carlos. So it was a pretty good friendly rivalry from an American point of view. And during the trials, they both made the finals, and when they started the finals, it was kind of a big deal. How is this going to turn out? Well, at the end of the race, Tommie Smith wins the gold medal, placing first, and John Carlos wins the bronze medal, finishing third. He was upset in the race by another runner who we'll get to later. So Smith wins the gold medal, finishing first, and Carlos wins the bronze medal, finishing third. And as you know in Olympic history, the top three in each event get to go to the medal ceremony, and they present them their medals, and they play the national anthem of the first place athlete, and the rest stand on the podium as well. I think you've all seen that. Well, both of these men, Carlos and Smith, wore buttons. You have a copy of it, I gave you yesterday, called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And this was simply an organization that mainly black people were a part of, that were Olympic athletes that supported human rights, especially for Negroes. Well, during the medal ceremony, both men had made arrangements to protest the treatment of Negroes in the United States during both the flag raising and the playing of the national anthem during the medal ceremony. This is all pre-planned. They both knew they had to get on the medal stand for this to happen, right? And they eventually did. So both men during the medal ceremony will protest the treatment of Negroes in the United States during the raising of the American flag and playing of the national anthem. And they did so in 4 different ways. On the medal stand, both men wore black scarves around their necks. They wore black scarves around their necks. They wore beads around their necks. They rolled up their sweatpants, took their shoes off, and displayed their black socks. They took their shoes off, rolled up their sweats a little bit, and displayed their black socks. Both men were wearing Puma running shoes. You probably know what Puma are, right? This just happens to be the 50th anniversary of what we're talking about. Puma came out with a new shoe. Okay? They also placed black gloves on their hands and raised them into the air during the national anthem in protest. So during the medal ceremony, both Tommie Smith and John Carlos wore black scarves around their necks during the playing of the national anthem. They also wore beads around their necks during the playing of the national anthem. They also rolled up their sweatpants, took off their shoes, and displayed their black socks during the playing of the national anthem. And they both placed a black glove on one of their hands and raised their fist in protest during the medal ceremony. During the time that they did this, when their hands were in the air, they bowed their heads in prayer. Keep that in mind. Bowed their heads in prayer. Now, what did most people think the fist in the air stood for and the heads bowed? Black power. That is not what they were intending, but that's how it was perceived. Okay? Well, people around the world, especially white people around the world, and especially white people in the United States, were shocked at what they thought was a blatant disrespect to not only the American flag, but the national anthem as well. This is 1968. This isn't 2019, okay? 1968. Well, those two athletes suffered some pretty severe disciplinary actions. Contrary to popular rumor, they were allowed to keep their medals. They did not have to forfeit their medals. There's a lot of information out there that says they were stripped of their medals. That is not true. So they were allowed to keep their Olympic medals, but they were immediately suspended from the Olympic Games. Immediately suspended from the Olympic Games and expelled from the Olympic Village. So they were immediately suspended from the Olympic Games and expelled from the Olympic Village, which means basically they were what? Sent home. Absolutely, they were sent home. Well, that wasn't the end of it for John Carlos and Tommie Smith. When they got back to the United States, they were suspended from the U.S. track and field team as well. So when they got back to the United States, they were suspended from the United States track and field team as well. And if I would say from like 1968 to 2008, people tried to understand what they were doing, and finally by 2008 we kind of got it figured out, which I'll get to in a minute. But these guys received numerous death threats after they returned and had to overcome a lot of things during that time period. What did they do afterwards? Both of them played in the National Football League after their 1968 Olympic Games, briefly. Tommie Smith played 3 seasons with the Cincinnati Bengals. And John Carlos played 1 year with the Philadelphia Eagles. Very good. So, Tommie Smith played 3 years with the Cincinnati Bengals. John Carlos 1 year at the Philadelphia Eagles. They weren't football players necessarily, but what did they have? Speed. And a lot of times that happens. The NFL right now is into big, burly basketball players who they convert to tight ends in football. Antonio Gates may be the best example of that of the San Diego Chargers. What's that? Yeah. The athletes, that's what will happen is athletes will do that. So, they did go on with life. After that, Tommy Smith got a job at Santa Monica College in California, where he became a sociology professor and also was the head coach for both the cross-country and track and field teams. So after their stint in the NFL, Tommy Smith eventually went on to coach at Santa Monica College as a sociology professor and cross-country and track coach, and then went back to San Jose State and had a career in coaching and being a college professor. Probably cut, I'm not sure. Now this is what Smith was quoted as saying about his experience in Mexico City. You really don't have to write this down, but just listen to what he said. He said, now listen to this carefully. He said, I don't like the idea of people looking at it as negative, talking about the protest. There was nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head in prayer, acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing hatred for it. That was his take, but people didn't take it like that. John Carlos eventually became, ironically, a guidance counselor at a high school in California. And when asked about his experiences in Mexico City in 1968, this is what John Carlos said. See if you can figure out what he's saying here. He said, quote, I had a moral obligation to step up. He meant at the games. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations they had, meaning the Olympic Committee. So his point is he had a moral obligation to stick up for the rights of African Americans. And his morality was much more important than the rules and regulations that the Olympic Committee had. Well, as I mentioned, as time passed, the actions of Tommy Smith and John Carlos became more understood. And in 2008, both men were named recipients of the prestigious Arthur Ashe Courage Award at the ESPYs, sponsored by ESPN. Some of you maybe have seen those before. So finally in 2008, both Carlos and Smith were named the recipients of the very prestigious Arthur Ashe Courage Award at the ESPYs, which is sponsored by ESPN. Now, before we know the significance of them being honored as the recipient of the Arthur Ashe Courage Award, does anybody in here know who, I'd be surprised, but anybody know who Arthur Ashe is? Arthur Ashe was an African-American tennis player. Very few tennis players at the time he was playing were African-American. A wonderful human being, a very moral man, a wonderful person, who died of AIDS as a result of bad blood he received during one of several heart operations. And back in those days, if you got AIDS, you normally got it from illicit sex, right? Or having too many partners or whatever. You know a little bit about that, I'm sure. He didn't get it that way, right? He got it because of a bad blood transfusion and died, a horrible death. And so ESPN put up an Arthur Ashe Courage Award in his honor and give that annually, and they still do today. And in 2008, it was given to John Carlos and Tommy Smith. Great story. The guys are pretty revered now. They even built a statue of them on their alma mater, which we'll talk about. Okay? And there also is a really nice statue of him in the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., which we'll talk about after the video. But the most important and sad, one of the saddest stories I tell in the 2 years that I'll have you, is what happened to the third man on the podium. What happened to the man that placed second and won the silver medal? His name, Peter Norman. What happened to that man, Peter Norman? Well, Peter Norman was an Australian, and his time of 20.06 seconds in that race in 1968 still stands today as the fastest time in Australian track and field history. Today, 51 years later, he still holds the record. So the athlete who placed second in the 200-meter dash, earning the silver medal, was an Australian by the name of Peter Norman. And Peter Norman won the silver medal with a time of 20.06 seconds, which is still an Australian track record to this date, 51 years later. Records don't last 51 years, ever. Now, I want you to kind of listen to the story rather than worry about writing too much down. You can write down what you want. But as Norman is waiting for the medal ceremony, Tommy Smith and John Carlos give him one of the buttons that's being passed around, and they ask him if he would be willing to wear it during the medal ceremony. They said, "Do you support human rights?" "Well, yes, I do." Australia is a very racist country at the time. Blacks are oppressed. I mean, there's no doubt. And he agrees to wear the button. Where's the button, by the way?
That's right.
Okay, he agrees to wear the button. Okay, so they give him the button. And he decides he will wear it on the medal stand. He shows his support. Now here's an interesting story when you look at the picture. It was Peter Norman who solved a big problem. When John Carlos and Tommy Smith got to the medal stand, and obviously they must have done some planning, did they not? Carlos forgot his gloves. He forgot his pair of black gloves, because the plan was they were each going to wear a pair of black gloves and put their right fist in the air. Carlos forgot his gloves. And so it was Peter Norman that suggested that they just each wear one glove. That's why Tommy Smith has a right glove and John Carlos has a left glove in the picture. Originally they were supposed to, you have two gloves, right arm in the air. So just before the medal ceremony, it was John Carlos who forgot his gloves and Peter Norman who suggested that the two black athletes simply share. After it was over, and you got to remember, Peter Norman is in the first position because it goes second, first, third. So they're kind of standing this way. Now you kind of face this way to the crowd, and that time it was the other way, and you'll see. So Peter Norman doesn't see any of this protest. His back is to these two athletes. Does he know something's coming? Sure he does, but he really isn't a part of it other than he agreed to wear the wear the button. Well, immediately afterwards, the Australian Olympic Committee reprimands him for doing so. Harshly reprimands him. And that's not even the worst. This is what makes me just sad, is when you hear the story. You forget about the third man. Well, he gets back from the Olympic Games. He just ran the fastest time in the history of Australian track and field in the 200 meters, a record that still stands today, 51 years later. And when he gets back, he is absolutely ostracized, especially by the Australian media. And if you're ostracized by the media, that means they're either not telling anything about you at all, good, or they're criticizing. And he is just blasted by the Australian media for his actions. Just ostracized. Negative reports left and right. And these negative reports will follow him in the days, weeks, and years after his performance. It gets worse. Every 4 years you have an Olympic Games, right? That are supposed to be in Germany, at Munich. And so you have to go through trials, and you have to place in the top, so usually the top 3 in your event, in your country, and then you make the Olympic team and you go on. This is the defending silver medalist who holds the fastest time in the history of the country in the 200 meters. He gets left off the 72 team. And he finishes third in the Olympic trials in the 200. And even though he qualifies, they leave him off the team. I'm not kidding you, this is incredible. What an injustice. Well, he continues to compete in track and field. He's no longer going to be involved in the Olympic picture, but he continues his track and field career, and finally it ends in 1985 when he tears his Achilles tendon and cannot participate. So despite the injustice, he continues his track and field career, and finally in 1985, because of a torn Achilles, he is unable to compete. For the next decade, depression sets in, and he becomes an alcoholic. He gets several DWIs. And it gets sadder, because in 2000, when the Olympics are in Sydney, Australia, the Australian Olympic Committee has made arrangements for former great athletes to walk the opening lap with the Olympic flag, and he's not invited to come. Probably the greatest Olympic athlete in Australian history. Well, some people back in the United States, like Tommy Smith and John Carlos and other people, track officials that recognized what he had done, not only on the track, but also as far as human rights, put together a lot of pressure, and finally at the last minute he's invited and gets to go. Well, his life still continues to not be great. And on October 3rd of 2006, 1 year after they asked him to speak at the dedication of that statue at Smith and Carlos's alma mater, he dies of a heart at the age of 64. Just an incredibly, incredibly sad story. Guess who travels and serves as pallbearers for his funeral? John Carlos. It's a really, really sad story. But it is what it is. And I think that not only was this the most recognizable civil rights protest maybe ever in the world, because it was at an Olympic game, and now we give a lot of good accolades to Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the man that was completely treated horribly